The mist rose from the jungle floor like ghosts of the dead, and I knew, even as my boots hit the sand of Lingayen Gulf that January morning in 1945, that I would carry this moment with me for the rest of my life. Behind me, the landing craft churned away through waters still warm with the blood of kamikazes who had tried to stop us. Ahead, the green wall of Luzon stretched endlessly, hiding 260,000 Japanese soldiers who had sworn to die before surrendering. General MacArthur had made his promise. I shall return. Now it was up to us riflemen of the 6th Infantry Division to make good on that vow, one deadly mile at a time. My name is Tommy Kowalski, and I was 22 years old when I stepped onto Philippine soil for the second time in my young life. The first time, I'd been evacuated from Bataan in the chaos of 1942, watching our flag come down as the rising sun went up. 3 years later, I was back with a rifle in my hands and vengeance in my heart. The beach was eerily quiet that first morning of January 9th. No machine gun nests, no mortars falling like deadly rain. Just the whisper of waves and the distant rumble of our artillery pounding Japanese positions inland. It felt wrong somehow, like walking into a house where you know someone's hiding, waiting to jump out and scare you to death. Too easy, muttered Sergeant Murphy, spitting tobacco juice into the sand. Way too damned easy. He was right. The Japanese weren't stupid. General Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, they called him, wasn't about to waste his men on a beach we could pound flat with naval guns. He was pulling them back into the jungle, into the mountains, where every tree could hide a sniper and every trail could be booby-trapped with enough explosives to turn a squad into pink mist. We moved inland in loose formation, our M1 Garands locked and loaded, sweat already soaking through our olive-drab uniforms in the tropical heat. The 6th Infantry had been through hell already. We'd fought on New Guinea, bled on Zanzibar, and now we were back in the Philippines to finish what the Japanese had started 3 years ago. The first week was a nightmare of marching. 20 miles inland to take Clark Field, the big Japanese air base that had been pounded flat by our bombers but still needed to be secured. We advanced through rice paddies that sucked at our boots like quicksand, past burned-out villages where Filipino civilians emerged from hiding to wave small American flags they'd kept hidden for 3 years. Mabuhay! Mabuhay! They shouted, tears streaming down their faces. Long live America! It was enough to break your heart and fill you with pride at the same time. These people had suffered under Japanese occupation, starved, beaten, murdered by the thousands. They'd kept faith that we'd come back, and here we were. But the cost of that return was going to be written in blood, American and Japanese both. The jungle changed everything. One day we were marching through open country. The next we were swallowed by a green hell where you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. Vines thick as a man's waist hung like curtains between trees that shot up 100 feet into a canopy so thick it blocked out the sun. The air was thick enough to chew, heavy with the stench of rotting vegetation and something else, death, maybe, or just the promise of it. That's when the real war began. The first man we lost to a booby trap was Private Henderson from Arkansas. Sweet kid who talked about his girlfriend back home and showed everyone pictures of her at the church social. He was walking point when he tripped a wire connected to a 75mm shell buried in the trail. The explosion echoed through the jungle like thunder, and when the smoke cleared, there wasn't enough of Henderson left to send home to his mama, whispered Corporal Jackson, staring at the crater where Henderson had been. Sergeant Murphy grabbed Jackson by the shoulders and shook him hard. Eyes up, soldier. This is what they do. This is their game. But we're going to beat them at it. From that day forward, every step was a gamble with death. The Japanese were masters of jungle warfare. They'd proven that in Malaya and Burma. They knew how to use the terrain, how to turn every tree stump into a fighting position and every game trail into a killing ground. They dig spider holes so well camouflaged you could step on one without seeing it, then pop up behind you with a bayonet between your shoulder blades. But we learned. Oh, how we learned. We learned to watch for the glint of sunlight on metal that might be a rifle barrel. We learned to listen for the sound that didn't belong, the scrape of steel on wood, the rustle of cloth when there was no wind. We learned to smell them sometimes, the Japanese soldiers who'd been living in the jungle for months, eating rice and fish paste, their bodies giving off a different odor than ours. The worst part was the waiting. Hours of creeping through the green twilight, every nerve stretched tight as piano wire, waiting for the crack of a rifle or the whistle of a mortar shell. You'd hear every sound magnified, the drip of water from the leaves, the buzz of insects, the distant cry of some tropical bird that sounded almost human. Then it would come. A muzzle flash in the gloom, the sharp crack of a Japanese rifle, and suddenly the jungle would explode into violence. Bullets would whine off tree trunks, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Men would scream, sometimes in English, sometimes in Japanese, sometimes in languages pain creates that no dictionary contains. I remember one firefight in particular, maybe 2 weeks into the campaign. We were pushing through a valley where the Japanese had set up a series of interconnected bunkers, each one built so cleverly you couldn't see it until the machine guns opened up. They'd used logs and dirt and living trees, weaving their positions into the jungle itself. The attack started at dawn, with our artillery dropping shells just ahead of our advance. The explosions walked through the jungle like giant footsteps, each one sending up geysers of dirt and shattered wood. Then the barrage lifted, and we went in. I was carrying a Browning automatic rifle that day, 20 pounds of full auto hell that could chew through jungle undergrowth like a lawnmower. Behind me came Murphy with his Thompson submachine gun, and Jackson with the radio that would call in fire support if we needed it. The first bunker opened up when we were maybe 50 yards away. The muzzle flash lit up the green gloom like lightning, and bullets started clipping leaves all around us. I hit the ground hard, tasting dirt and dead vegetation, and brought the bar to bear. "There!" Murphy shouted, pointing to where the machine gun was chattering away. 11 o'clock. Base of that big tree. I couldn't see anything at first, just shadows and green. Then the gun fired again, and I caught the flash. There it was, a slit in what looked like a fallen log, but wasn't. The Japanese had built a bunker that looked like part of the forest floor itself. I squeezed the trigger and held it down, walking the burst of 30-6 rounds across the target. The bar bucked against my shoulder like a live thing, ejecting brass casings that clinked off the trees and rolled away into the undergrowth. I saw chunks of wood and dirt fly from the bunker, heard the whine of ricochets off concrete hidden beneath the camouflage. The machine gun went silent. "Got him," Jackson yelled, but he was wrong. There were more bunkers, and they all opened up at once. The jungle erupted. Muzzle flashes winked like deadly fireflies from positions we hadn't even known were there. Bullets buzzed through the air like angry hornets, thudding into tree trunks and whining off rocks. Someone was screaming. I think it might have been me. We were caught in a crossfire, pinned down in the middle of a killing ground the Japanese had prepared for us. This was their specialty, the ambush, the trap, the patient wait followed by overwhelming violence. They'd done it to the British in Singapore, to the Dutch in Java, to us in the Philippines 3 years ago. But we weren't the same army that had been caught with its pants down at Pearl Harbor. Murphy was on the radio, calling for fire support. Fire mission. Grid coordinates 779er 442. Japanese bunkers, dug in and concealed. Request immediate suppression. The response came crackling back through the static. Shot over. Shot out. Murphy replied, and we all pressed ourselves deeper into the jungle floor. The first shell came screaming in like an express train, passing overhead with a sound like ripping canvas. It exploded maybe 100 yards behind the Japanese positions, sending up a fountain of dirt and shattered trees. Add 200. Murphy shouted into the radio. Fire for effect. What followed was a symphony of destruction. Our 105mm howitzers back at the firebase opened up in a full battery salvo, sending shells arcing over the jungle to crash down on the Japanese set positions. The explosions walked back and forth across the bunker complex like a giant stamping his feet, each one sending shock waves through the ground that we could feel in our bones. The Japanese machine guns went silent one by one. Trees crashed down under the pounding, and chunks of concrete that had been hidden under logs and dirt came flying through the air. The jungle itself seemed to scream under the bombardment. When the shelling stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Our ears were ringing, and smoke drifted through trees like fog. But we could hear something else now, voices calling in Japanese, some of them sounding hurt. Fix bayonets, Murphy ordered quietly. We're going in. The click of steel on steel as we mounted our bayonets was somehow the most frightening sound I'd ever heard. It meant we were going to fight hand to hand, eye to eye, in the wreckage of what had been a peaceful jungle an hour ago. We moved forward in a line, stepping carefully over fallen trees and shell craters. The air smelled of cordite and churned earth and something else, the copper smell of blood, lots of it. The first bunker was a shambles. The artillery had caved in one side, leaving a gaping hole that looked like a wound in the earth. I could see movement inside, so I pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it in. The explosion was muffled by the concrete and dirt, but final. The second bunker was still intact, its machine gun pointing skyward where the barrel had been bent by shell fragments. But there were voices inside, and Murphy gestured for us to surround it. Come out, he shouted in his broken Japanese. Surrender. War is over for you. The response was immediate, a rifle shot that whistled past his ear. Then more shots, and we could hear them moving around inside, getting ready to make a last stand. That's when I understood something about the Japanese soldiers we were fighting. They weren't monsters, they were men like us, scared and far from home. But they'd been taught that surrender was worse than death, that to be captured was the ultimate dishonor. They would fight to the last man, to the last bullet, because their culture and their military training had left them no other choice. It made killing them both easier and harder at the same time. Jackson worked his way around to the back of the bunker while Murphy and I kept them busy from the front. When he was in position, he shoved his Thompson through a gun port and emptied a full drum of .45 caliber bullets into the enclosed space. The silence that followed was complete. We found 7 Japanese soldiers inside that bunker. They'd been living there for weeks, maybe months, with their rice and ammunition and their emperor's portrait nailed to one wall. Some of them couldn't have been older than 18. All of them had died fighting. That was the pattern of the whole campaign. Every mile we advanced was paid for in blood, ours and theirs. The Japanese had divided Luzon into defensive zones, each one designed to bleed us white before we could reach the next one. They had no intention of holding territory. Their job was to kill as many Americans as possible before they died themselves. General Yamashita was no fool. He knew he couldn't win, but he could make victory so expensive that maybe we'd think twice about invading Japan itself. Every dead Gi was a small victory for the emperor. Every casualty report sent back to the States was ammunition for the peace faction in Washington. But MacArthur wasn't backing down, and neither were we. We had promises to keep, to the Filipinos who'd suffered under Japanese occupation, to our buddies who died on Bataan and Corregidor, to ourselves and the country that had sent us halfway around the world to fight this war. The Filipino guerrillas were a godsend. They'd been fighting the Japanese for 3 years, living in the jungle, striking at convoys and communications, keeping the resistance alive. They knew every trail, every water source, every place the Japanese might set up an ambush. Without them, we'd have been stumbling blind through that green hell. I remember one guerrilla fighter in particular, a man named Santos who couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds soaking wet, but who'd been killing Japanese soldiers since 1942. He spoke perfect English, had been a school teacher before the war, and could track a man through the jungle like a bloodhound. The Japanese, they do not understand this place, he told me one evening as we shared a can of sea rations. They think jungle is like park in Tokyo, organized, predictable. But jungle is alive. It has moods, secrets. We know these things. They do not. He was right. The Japanese were good soldiers, disciplined and brave, but they were fighting on our terms now. Every Filipino villager was a potential spy for us. Every trail they used could be reported to our intelligence officers. The guerrillas had spent 3 years mapping every Japanese position, counting their supplies, learning their habits. The tide had turned, and both sides knew it. Still, the fighting was brutal. The Japanese had perfected the art of the delaying action, hit us hard, fall back to the next position, hit us again. They'd mine the trails behind them, booby trap abandoned positions, leave snipers in trees to pick off our scouts and radiomen. I lost count of how many men we buried in shallow graves beside jungle trails. Good men, most of them, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit and college kids from California who joined up after Pearl Harbor. They'd learned to be soldiers in the crucible of combat, and then they died before they could use what they'd learned. The worst was when we'd lose someone to a sniper. You'd be walking along, talking about home or complaining about heat, and suddenly the man next to you would just collapse. No warning, no chance to fight back, just the crack of a rifle from somewhere in the green maze around us, and another American boy was gone. We got good at hunting snipers, though. The Japanese would usually fire one shot and then try to slip away to another position. But if you knew what to look for, the tiny cloud of powder smoke, the flash of muzzle blast, the direction the bullet had come from, you could narrow down where they were hiding. Then it became a game of patience. We'd have one man keep watch on the suspected tree while the rest of us worked our way around behind it. Sometimes it took hours. Sometimes the sniper would give himself away by moving at the wrong moment, or we'd spot the glint of his rifle scope in a shaft of sunlight. When we found them, we showed no mercy. A sniper was a special kind of enemy, personal, intimate, deadly. He'd study you through his scope, learn your habits, wait for the perfect moment to put a bullet through your head. Killing a sniper felt like killing a predator, something that had been hunting you and your friends. But even as we fought our way deeper into Luzon, we could see that the Japanese were running out of time and options. Their supply lines were cut, their air force was gone, and more American divisions were landing every week. Almost 175,000 men came ashore along a 20-mile beachhead within a few days, and more were coming behind them. The Japanese soldiers were getting hungrier, their equipment was wearing out, and their ammunition was running low. We'd find abandoned positions where they'd left behind broken rifles and empty rice bags. Some of their soldiers were so weak from malnutrition they could barely carry their weapons. But they kept fighting. That was the thing about them that both impressed and horrified us. They just would not quit. Even when it was obvious the war was lost, even when they were surrounded and outgunned, they'd fight to the death rather than surrender. I think about that sometimes, about what drives a man to choose death over defeat. We Americans, we fight to win and then go home. But those Japanese soldiers, they were fighting for something else, honor, maybe, or faith in their emperor, or just the idea that dying in battle was better than living in shame. It made them dangerous right up to the end. By March, we were pushing into the mountains of northern Luzon, where Yamashita had pulled back his remaining force for a final stand. The terrain was even worse up there, steep ridges covered in jungle, deep valleys where the fog never lifted, trails that were little more than goat paths clinging to the sides of cliffs. Every peak was a fortress, every valley a potential trap. The Japanese had been preparing these positions for months, digging tunnels and bunkers into the mountainsides, stockpiling ammunition and supplies. They were going to make us pay for every yard of ground in blood. But we had advantages they couldn't match. Our artillery could reach anywhere on the island, our planes controlled skies, and our supply lines stretched all the way back to the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. Most importantly, we had the will to finish what we'd started, no matter what it cost. The final assault began in April. Battalion after battalion of American infantry, supported by tanks and artillery and close air support, attacked the Japanese mountain positions. It was like trying to dig ants out of an anthill with a spoon, slow, bloody work that had to be done one bunker at a time. I was part of the assault on Hill 875, a jungle-covered peak that dominated the approaches to Baguio, where Yamashita had his headquarters. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress with interconnected bunkers and tunnels that let them move from position to position without exposing themselves to our fire. We attacked at dawn after a night-long artillery barrage that should have killed anything on that hill. But when we started up the slope, the Japanese were waiting for us. They'd learned our tactics by then, knew that we'd soften them up with artillery and then come straight at them with infantry. So they'd pulled back into the deepest bunkers during the shelling, then moved back to their fighting positions when it lifted. The first 100 yards were the worst. The Japanese had clear fields of fire down the slope, and their machine guns were positioned to create interlocking zones of death. Men were falling all around me, crying out for medics or just lying still in the churned mud. I made it to a shell crater about halfway up the hill and dove in, gasping for breath and trying to figure out where the fire was coming from. Next to me was a kid from Texas named Rodriguez, who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. He was bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his leg, but he was still firing his rifle at the Japanese positions. "We're gonna die up here," he said matter-of-factly, working the bolt on his Springfield. "Ain't no way around it." Maybe he was right. Maybe we were all going to die on that godforsaken hill in the middle of nowhere, fighting for a piece of ground that most Americans couldn't find on a map. But we kept fighting anyway, because that's what soldiers do. You fight for the man next to you, for the guys who are counting on you, for the mission you've been given, whether it makes sense or not. That's when the Japanese counterattacked. They came out of their bunkers screaming, "Banzai," and ran straight at us with bayonets fixed and swords flashing in the jungle sunlight. It was like something out of a nightmare. Dozens of Japanese soldiers charging through the smoke and dust, their faces twisted with a mixture of outrage and desperation. We met them with rifle fire first, cutting down the leaders and breaking up their formation. But some of them made it through, and then it was hand-to-hand combat in the shell craters and bomb-blasted trees. I killed 3 men with my bayonet that day. Not shot them, not blew them up with a grenade, killed them face to face with 18 inches of American steel. I can still see their faces sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night. Young faces, old faces, all of them with the same expression of surprise when they realized that they were dying. But we held the hill. When the sun went down that evening, the Stars and Stripes was flying from a makeshift pole where the Japanese flag had been that morning. Japan lost nearly all of its 230,000 military personnel on the island, and every one of those deaths brought us closer to the end of the war. The final collapse came quickly after that. With their mountain stronghold broken, the scattered Japanese units had nowhere to run and no way to resupply. Some of them kept fighting as individuals or small groups, hiding in caves and jungle clearings, but they were no longer an organized military force. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender over the radio. The war was over. We'd won. I was sitting by a stream in the mountains of northern Luzon when the news came down, cleaning my rifle and thinking about home. 3.5 years of war, from Pearl Harbor to this moment, and it was finally finished. Some of the guys whooped and hollered when they heard. Others just sat quietly, like they couldn't quite believe it was real. A few of them cried, not from joy, but from relief and exhaustion and grief for all the friends who hadn't lived to see this day. I thought about Henderson, who'd stepped on that booby trap back in January, about Rodriguez, who died on Hill 875 with a Japanese sword in his chest, about all the others whose names were carved on wooden crosses in graves scattered across a dozen Pacific islands. They'd never see home again, never marry their sweethearts or have children or grow old telling stories about the war. But they'd done their job. They'd helped break the back of the Japanese Empire and bring peace to the world. MacArthur had kept his promise. We'd returned to the Philippines, driven out the invaders, and restored freedom to a nation that had waited 3 long years for liberation. The cost had been terrible. The American 6th and 8th Armies lost more than 10,300 troops killed in ground combat, with another 36,550 wounded in action, but the job was done. As I sit here now, an old man remembering a young soldier's war, I think about what it all meant. We weren't fighting for territory or resources or even revenge, though God knows we had reason enough for that. We were fighting for the idea that free people shouldn't have to live under the boot of tyrants, that small nations have the right to determine their own destiny, that there are some things worth dying for. The mist still rises from jungle floors in my dreams, and I can still hear the distant rumble of artillery echoing through green valleys. But I also remember the faces of Filipino children who ran out to wave American flags, and the tears of gratitude in their parents' eyes, and the knowledge that we'd helped write a chapter in the long story of human freedom. That's what we gave our youth for on those bloody beaches and jungle trails. That's what made it worth the price we paid. And that's why, even now, even with all the nightmares and all the ghosts, I'm proud to have been there when my country needed me most. The promise was kept.